The morning air cut through downtown like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. 11-year-old Jamal pressed his thin frame against the brick wall of an alley, watching the city wake up around him. His clothes hung loose on his small body. A faded gray shirt with holes near the collar, jeans too big for his waist, and sneakers held together with duct tape. The backpack on his shoulders contained everything he owned. A broken notebook with pages falling out, a pencil stub worn down to nothing, and a photograph he never looked at anymore. But Jamal's eyes told a different story than his appearance suggested. Dark and intense, they moved constantly, calculating, measuring, finding patterns where others saw chaos. The cracks in the sidewalk formed mathematical sequences that whispered to him. The rhythm of traffic lights followed probability curves. Even the way pigeons scattered followed predictable geometric patterns that made perfect sense in his mind. Numbers had always been his escape. When the foster homes got too loud, when the other kids called him weird, when the adults looked at him like he was broken, Jamal would close his eyes and let equations flow through his thoughts like music. Calculus at age 8, differential equations by 9. Now, at 11, he could see mathematical relationships that university professors spent years trying to understand. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was probably the smartest kid in the city, maybe the country, and he was sleeping in doorways and digging through trash cans for food. His last foster family, the Hendersons, had discovered his gift 6 months ago when they found him solving their teenage son's calculus homework in minutes. At first, they were amazed. Then they saw opportunity. They started small, helping neighbors with their kids' math problems for $20 here and there. But word spread quickly. Soon, they were charging hundreds for Jamal to tutor wealthy families' children. They made him wear clean clothes and coached him to smile on command. Show them the multiplication tables, Jamal. Do the thing with the square roots. Make them think their kid is normal compared to you. The breaking point came when Mr. Henderson arranged for Jamal to demonstrate his abilities at a private school fundraiser. They dressed him up like a performing monkey, had him solve complex problems, while donors bid on having him tutor their children. That night, listening to them discuss his market value and earning potential, Jamal realized he wasn't their son. He was their product. So he ran. 3 weeks ago, in the middle of the night, he grabbed his backpack and walked out of the only stability he'd known in years. The streets were dangerous, cold, and uncertain, but at least they were honest about what they offered. Nobody pretended to love him here. Nobody used words like family while calculating how much money his brain could generate. Now, shivering in the morning cold, Jamal watched well-dressed people hurry past without seeing him. Invisible. That was fine with him. Being invisible meant being safe from people who might want to use him again. He'd learned to find food in restaurant dumpsters, to sleep in places where security guards wouldn't look, to avoid the social workers who asked too many questions. But the numbers never stopped. They danced in his head even when he tried to push them away. The frequency of bus arrivals, the angles of shadows as the sun moved across the sky, the statistical probability of which strangers might drop loose change. Everything was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Jamal pushed himself away from the wall and started walking. His stomach ached with hunger, but he'd learned to ignore that too. Survival was just another math problem. Calculate the risks, find the optimal solution, execute the plan. Emotion was a variable that made equations unstable. The towering glass building ahead drew his attention. Meridian Industries, according to the golden letters above the entrance. He'd walked past it dozens of times, always curious about what happened behind those shining walls. Today, something was different. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see people moving with unusual urgency. Men in expensive suits gestured frantically. Women in sharp business attire hurried between floors carrying thick folders and laptops. Jamal pressed his nose against the cold glass, watching the controlled chaos inside. His mathematical mind immediately began analyzing patterns of movement, trying to decode the story being told through body language and spatial relationships. Whatever was happening in there, it was big, and from the expressions on their faces, it wasn't going well. A woman in a red blazer pushed through the revolving door, talking rapidly into her phone. "The calculations are wrong," she was saying. Everything is wrong. If we can't fix this by noon, the whole project collapses. Jamal stepped back as she hurried past, but her words echoed in his mind. Calculations, problems, numbers that needed fixing. For the first time in weeks, something other than survival occupied his thoughts. Whatever was wrong in that building, whatever mathematical problem had all those intelligent, expensive people panicking, he wondered if he could see the solution they couldn't. The warm air from the building's ventilation system washed over him through the door crack, carrying the scent of coffee and leather and success. For just a moment, Jamal imagined what it would feel like to belong in a place like that, not as someone's prize or project, but as himself, a boy who understood numbers the way other kids understood video games. But that was a dangerous thought. Wanting things led to disappointment. Trusting people led to betrayal. The streets had taught him that the only reliable relationship was with numbers themselves, pure, honest, unchanging truth that couldn't lie or manipulate or abandon you. Still, as he turned to walk away, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening behind those glass walls. Something that maybe, just maybe, only he could understand. The moment Jamal slipped through the revolving door behind a distracted executive, the warmth hit him like an embrace he hadn't felt in months. His body, accustomed to the bitter cold of doorways and park benches, almost trembled with relief. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and steel, with chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars. Security guards in crisp uniforms stood at attention, but they were focused on the chaos erupting from the upper floors, not on one small boy who moved like a shadow. Jamal followed the sound of raised voices. His bare feet, toughened by weeks on concrete, made no sound on the polished floor. The elevator doors were opening and closing constantly as people rushed between floors, their faces masks of barely controlled panic. He slipped into an elevator behind a group of engineers, pressing himself into the corner, where he became just another shadow. 16th floor. Someone said, "Emergency meeting. This is at make or break time." The numbers above the elevator doors climbed steadily. Jamal's mathematical mind automatically calculated the building's dimensions, the speed of ascent, the structural engineering required to support this much glass and steel. But louder than these background calculations were the fragments of conversation swirling around him. The wing stress analysis is completely wrong. We've been working on this for 18 months. How is it possible that everything is falling apart now? Because someone made a fundamental error in the initial calculations, and we've been building on that foundation ever since. Jamal's pulse quickened. These weren't just business problems. These were mathematical problems. Real ones. Complex ones. The kind that made his mind light up with possibility. The elevator doors opened on the 16th floor, revealing a scene of controlled disaster. The hallway buzzed with activity. Men and women in $1,000 suits hurried between conference rooms, their phones pressed to their ears, their voices tight with stress. Through glass walls, Jamal could see meeting rooms filled with whiteboards covered in equations, computer screens displaying complex modeling software, and tables buried under blueprints and technical documents. He followed the crowd toward the largest conference room, where the voices were loudest and the tension most palpable. Through the glass wall, he saw them, a room full of the most powerful, educated, expensive minds that money could buy, all staring at a whiteboard with the helpless frustration of students who couldn't solve a basic algebra problem. At the center of it all stood a man who was clearly in charge. Richard Grant, according to the nameplate on the table in front of him. Late 40s, silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. But his face told the real story. This was a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant was saying, his voice strained but still commanding, "we have exactly 4 hours before the Federal Aviation Administration review. 4 hours to solve a problem that has stumped our best engineers for 3 weeks. If we can't provide them with working calculations, Meridian Industries loses the largest aerospace contract in our company's history. We're not talking about missing quarterly projections. We're talking about bankruptcy." The room was silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below. Jamal pressed closer to the glass, his eyes automatically scanning the whiteboard. Even from this distance, he could see the equations, thrust calculations, wing loading analysis, fuel efficiency ratios. His mind began processing the numbers, finding connections, identifying patterns. An older man in a gray suit, obviously one of the lead engineers, stepped forward. "Sir, we've run these calculations through every software program we have. We've consulted with aerospace engineers from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech. The mathematics simply don't work. The aircraft design is fundamentally flawed." Grant's composure cracked slightly. "That's impossible. This design passed preliminary review. The computer models showed it was sound." "The computer models were wrong," another engineer said quietly. "Or rather, the initial parameters we fed into the models were wrong. Garbage in, garbage out. We've been building on a foundation of mathematical errors for over a year." A woman in an elegant black dress, clearly one of the investors, stood up abruptly. "Mr. Grant, we've invested $47 million in this project based on your assurances that the technology was proven. Are you telling us that your engineers can't do basic mathematics?" Dr. Sarah Chun has 3 doctoral degrees and 20 years of experience in aerospace engineering. Grant shot back, gesturing to one of the women at the whiteboard. "If she can't solve it, it can't be solved." But Jamal could see it. Standing there in his ragged clothes, invisible to everyone in the room, he could see exactly what they were missing. The equations on the board weren't wrong. They were incomplete. They were solving for static conditions when they needed to account for dynamic variables. They were treating the wing as a rigid structure when it needed to be understood as a flexible system responding to changing air pressure and temperature conditions. His hands itched to grab a marker, to show them what they couldn't see. But he was just a homeless kid pressing his face against glass, watching a world he could never be part of. The smart, educated people in expensive clothes would never listen to someone like him. They couldn't even see him. Inside the room, the arguments were getting louder. Voices were raised. Fingers were pointed. The calm professionalism was cracking under the pressure of impending disaster. Jamal watched Grant lean heavily against the conference table, his head in his hands, the weight of failure crushing down on his shoulders. "There has to be an answer," Grant whispered, so quietly that only the people closest to him could hear. "There has to be something we're not seeing." Jamal's chest tightened with an emotion he hadn't felt in months, the desire to help. Not because he wanted something in return, not because he was being forced to perform, but because he could see the solution, and watching them struggle was almost physically painful. These people weren't using him or exploiting him. They didn't even know he existed. For the first time since he could remember, his gift felt like exactly that, a gift he could choose to give freely. The question was whether he had the courage to step out of the shadows and into a room full of strangers who would see only what he looked like, not what he could do. Outside the glass walls, invisible and safe, Jamal took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed open the conference room door. The heavy glass panel swung inward with a soft whoosh, and suddenly every conversation in the room stopped. 23 of the most powerful people in the aerospace industry turned to stare at a small, dirty boy standing in their pristine boardroom. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jamal could feel their eyes taking inventory of everything wrong with his presence here. His torn clothes, his bare feet, the way he clutched his empty backpack like a shield. A security guard started moving toward him from the corner of the room, hand reaching for his radio. "Wait," Richard Grant said, his voice cutting through the tension. Something in his tone made everyone freeze. Grant's eyes were locked on Jamal, and there was a desperation there that the boy recognized. It was the same expression he'd seen in his own reflection during the worst nights on the street, the look of someone who had run out of options. "Son," Grant said carefully, "this is a private meeting. You shouldn't be here." Jamal's mouth was dry, but he forced the words out. "I can fix it." His voice came out smaller than he intended, barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard him clearly. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Someone laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. An investor muttered something about security. The lead engineer shook her head with the patient condescension adults reserved for children who didn't understand adult problems. But Grant held up his hand again, and the room fell silent. "What did you say?" This time, Jamal's voice was stronger. "I said I can fix it. Your calculations, they're not wrong, they're just incomplete." The laughter was louder now, spreading through the room like a wave. "This is ridiculous," said the woman in the black dress. "We're facing a $47 million disaster, and you want us to listen to a child who wandered in from the street." But Grant wasn't laughing. Something in the boy's manner, the confidence in his voice despite his obvious fear, had caught his attention. In 18 months of engineering failures and mathematical dead ends, Grant had learned to recognize the difference between people who thought they knew something and people who actually did. "Everyone be quiet," Grant said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Let him talk." Jamal walked slowly toward the whiteboard, his eyes scanning the equations that had defeated MIT graduates and industry experts. The numbers sang to him, showing him patterns and relationships that seemed invisible to everyone else in the room. He could feel their stares boring into him, could hear whispered comments about his appearance, but none of that mattered now. The mathematics was all that mattered. "You're treating the wing like it's solid," Jamal said, pointing to a series of calculations in the upper left corner of the board. "But when it's flying, it flexes. The air pressure changes as it moves through different altitudes and weather conditions. You need to account for dynamic loading, not just static weight distribution." Dr. Chun, the lead engineer, stepped closer to the board. "Those calculations are for standard atmospheric conditions," she said, but her voice had lost its dismissive edge. "We factor in variations." "Not enough," Jamal replied, picking up a marker with trembling fingers. "Look at this coefficient here. You're using sea level air density for the entire flight profile, but the plane will spend most of its time at 35,000 feet, where the air is completely different. The wing experiences different stress patterns at different altitudes." He began writing on the board, his small hand moving quickly across the white surface. Numbers flowed out of him like water, correction factors, pressure differentials, stress calculations that took into account the wing's flexibility under varying conditions. The room had gone completely silent except for the squeak of the marker. "The fuel load distribution is wrong too," Jamal continued, his voice growing more confident as he lost himself in the mathematics. "You calculated based on full tanks, but as the fuel burns off during flight, the weight distribution changes. The center of gravity shifts. The wing loading becomes asymmetrical unless you compensate." An engineer near the back of the room was frantically typing into his laptop, running Jamal's corrections through analysis software. "My God," he whispered. "The stress patterns, they're actually balancing out." Grant moved closer to the board, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How are you doing this? These are graduate-level aerospace engineering calculations." Jamal didn't answer immediately. He was drawing now, sketching a wing cross-section and showing how airflow patterns changed under different loading conditions. His diagram was crude but accurate, showing details that their expensive computer models had missed. "The turbulence calculations are wrong too," he said, adding arrows to show airflow patterns. "You're modeling smooth air, but real flight involves constant microturbulence. The wing has to be flexible enough to handle thousands of tiny pressure changes every minute, not just the big ones you can measure." Dr. Chun was staring at the board with the expression of someone watching a miracle. "This is impossible," she breathed. "These calculations, I've never seen anyone integrate dynamic variables like this. Where did you learn this?" Jamal set down the marker and stepped back from the board. Half of the whiteboard was now covered with his corrections, a dense web of equations, diagrams, and mathematical relationships that transformed the original flawed design into something that could actually fly. "I taught myself," he said simply. "Numbers make sense. They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not. They just are." The room erupted. Engineers crowded forward to examine his work. Calculators and laptops appeared as people rushed to verify his calculations. Phones came out to photograph the board. The investor who had been ready to walk out 5 minutes earlier was now staring at Jamal like he was a visitor from another planet. Grant's voice cut through the chaos. Check it. Check every single calculation. Use every software program we have. I want to know if this boy just saved our company or if this is some kind of elaborate joke. But even as he spoke, Grant already knew the answer. He could see it in Dr. Chen's face, in the way the other engineers were nodding as they worked through Jamal's mathematics. After 18 months of failure, after $47 million in development costs, after bringing the company to the brink of bankruptcy, the solution had walked in through their conference room door in the form of an 11-year-old boy in ragged clothes. As the verification continued and the excitement built around him, Jamal felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen this look before, the amazement, the hunger, the sudden recognition of what his brain could be worth. Soon would come the questions about where he lived, who his parents were, whether he might be available for other projects. The mathematics had been pure, clean, honest. But now came the complicated part, dealing with the people who would want to own what he could do. In the growing chaos of celebration around him, Jamal clutched his backpack tighter and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The verification took exactly 43 minutes. Jamal counted every second, watching the adults around him transform from skeptics to believers to something that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. He sat in a leather chair that was too big for him, his legs dangling above the floor, while 23 of the most powerful people in aerospace engineering dissected his work with the intensity of archaeologists examining a priceless artifact. Dr. Chen ran his calculations through 3 different software programs. Each time, the computer confirmed what everyone in the room was beginning to understand. The homeless boy had solved in minutes what their team couldn't figure out in months. The wing stress analysis was perfect. The fuel distribution calculations were flawless. Even the microturbulence modeling showed an understanding of aerodynamics that shouldn't exist in someone without years of formal training. "It's not possible," muttered James Harrison, one of the senior investors. He was pacing behind Jamal's chair, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. 11 years old, no formal education, living on the streets. How does someone like that develop this level of mathematical sophistication? Grant was standing at the whiteboard, studying Jamal's work with the reverence of someone looking at a master painting. "The integration of variables is extraordinary," he said quietly. "He's not just solving individual problems. He's seeing how every element affects every other element simultaneously. It's like he can visualize the entire mathematical ecosystem at once." Dr. Sarah Kim, the company's head of research and development, was typing rapidly on her tablet. "I've been running projections based on his corrections. The fuel efficiency increases by 17%. The payload capacity goes up by 12%. The stress tolerances are within acceptable parameters for the first time since we started this project. This isn't just a solution, it's an optimization that makes our design better than anything our competitors have." The words washed over Jamal like ice water. Fuel efficiency, payload capacity, optimization. They were already talking about him like he was in the room, discussing what his brain could do for their company, as if he were a piece of equipment they were considering purchasing. "We need to know more about him," Harrison was saying. "His background, his living situation, his legal status. A mind like this can't just be wandering the streets. There are applications beyond aerospace, defense contracts, computer modeling, financial analysis. The potential revenue streams are enormous." Grant turned away from the whiteboard to look at Jamal directly. "Son, I need to ask you something important. Where are your parents? Do you have family we should contact?" The question Jamal had been dreading. He could lie, make up a story about parents who were temporarily away, give them an address that didn't exist. But the exhaustion of 3 weeks on the street had worn down his defenses, and something about Grant's tone suggested he already suspected the truth. "I don't have parents," Jamal said quietly. "Not anymore." "Foster care?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "I ran away." The words came out flat, emotionless. 3 weeks ago." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, uncomfortable. These people were comfortable discussing million-dollar contracts and complex engineering problems, but a homeless child was outside their expertise. Harrison cleared his throat. Well, that actually simplifies things from a legal standpoint. Foster children are wards of the state, which means nothing. Jamal interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the businessman's calculating tone. I'm not signing anything. I'm not working for anyone. I solved your problem because I could see the answer, and it was making me crazy watching you struggle with it. That doesn't mean you own me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison's expression hardened. Son, you're 11 years old and living on the street. You need adult supervision, proper education, a stable environment. What we're offering could change your entire life. Like my last foster family changed my life. Jamal stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. They found out I could do calculus, and suddenly I wasn't their son anymore. I was their business opportunity. They made me perform for their friends, solve problems for money, prove how smart I was whenever they needed to impress someone. They didn't see a kid who needed a family. They saw a trained animal that could do tricks with numbers. The adults in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dr. Chin took a step forward, her voice carefully gentle. Jamal, what happened to you is wrong. But not everyone is like that. Some people would value your gift and still treat you with respect. Gift? Jamal's laugh was bitter, older than his 11 years. You want to know what my gift feels like? It feels like being alone in a room full of people who only care about what you can do for them. It feels like never having a normal conversation because everyone wants to test you or show you off or figure out how to make money from your brain. It feels like being the smartest person in the room and the loneliest person in the world at the same time. Grant was studying Jamal with an intensity that made the boy uncomfortable. Is that why you're on the street? Because you'd rather be homeless than be used. At least out there, nobody pretends to love me while they're figuring out my market value. Jamal replied. At least the streets are honest about what they offer. The silence that followed was deafening. These were people accustomed to solving problems with money, contracts, and negotiations. They could build aircraft that defied gravity, but they had no idea how to address the pain of a brilliant child who had been betrayed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. Harrison tried a different approach. Jamal, you have to be practical. Your mathematical abilities are extraordinary, but you're still a child. You need food, shelter, education. You can't survive on the streets indefinitely, and your gifts are too valuable to waste. There it is, Jamal said quietly. Too valuable to waste. Not you're too valuable as a person. Not every child deserves safety and love. My gifts are too valuable. That's all any of you see when you look at me. Grant moved closer, his voice gentler than it had been since the meeting started. What if that's not all we see? What if we could figure out a way to help you that doesn't involve using you? How? Jamal challenged. You're business people. Everything is a transaction. You solve a problem, you get paid. You provide value. You receive compensation. I fix your airplane design. I get food and shelter and education. But what happens when the next problem comes along? What happens when you realize how much money my brain could make for your company? Dr. Chin knelt down, so she was at Jamal's eye level. What would you want, Jamal? If you could have anything, safety, family, the chance to learn and grow without being exploited, what would that look like? For the first time since entering the room, Jamal's composure cracked. His voice became small, vulnerable, revealing the frightened child beneath the mathematical genius. I want someone to care about me when I can't solve their problems. I want to be wrong sometimes, without disappointing anyone. I want to play video games and eat pizza and argue about stupid things like normal kids do. I want to matter for who I am, not just for what I can do. The room was completely silent. 23 successful adults, collectively worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sat speechless in the face of an 11-year-old boy's simple desire to be loved unconditionally. Grant's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. Jamal, what if I told you that saving our company isn't the most important thing you did when you walked into this room? What if the most important thing was showing us what we'd forgotten about treating people with dignity? For the first time since entering the building, Jamal looked directly into Grant's eyes, searching for sincerity in a world that had taught him to expect manipulation. What he saw there would determine not just his immediate future, but whether he could ever trust another adult again. The weight of 23 pairs of eyes bore down on Jamal as he stared into Richard Grant's face, searching for the lie he was certain would be there. In his 11 years of life, every adult who had discovered his abilities had worn that same expression of amazed concern right before they started calculating his worth in dollars and opportunities. But something in Grant's eyes was different. The businessman who had been desperate to save his company 5 minutes ago now seemed more concerned with saving the boy standing before him. Grant slowly lowered himself into a chair across from Jamal, making himself smaller, less intimidating. "You know what I learned today?" Grant said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I learned that I built a company worth $47 million, but I never learned how to see a child as anything more than a solution to my problems. That makes me poor in the ways that matter most." Harrison started to speak, but Grant held up his hand without looking away from Jamal. "When you walked into this room, I saw your mathematical ability before I saw your hunger. I noticed your genius before I noticed that you're just a kid who needs someone to care about him. That's not your failure, Jamal. That's mine." Dr. Chun was nodding, tears forming in her eyes. "He's right. We were so amazed by what you could do that we forgot to ask how you were feeling, whether you were scared, whether you needed help in ways that have nothing to do with equations." Jamal felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart during 3 weeks on the streets, reinforced by months of being treated like a performing animal. "You're just saying that because you think it's what I want to hear," he whispered. "Tomorrow, when there's another problem to solve, you'll remember what my brain can do for your company." "Maybe," Grant admitted, and his honesty startled Jamal more than false reassurances would have. "Maybe I would. Maybe the businessman in me would see another opportunity to put your abilities to work. But that's exactly why I need you to teach me how to be better than that." The room remained frozen in silence as Grant continued. "Jamal, I've spent 20 years building this company, hiring the smartest people I could find, solving impossible problems with intelligence and determination. But in all that time, I never once stopped to ask whether the smart people working for me felt valued as human beings, not just as collections of useful skills." Grant gestured to the whiteboard covered with Jamal's corrections. "You didn't just save our aircraft design today. You showed me that intelligence without compassion is just sophisticated cruelty. You taught me that genius trapped in loneliness isn't a gift, it's a tragedy." Harrison couldn't contain himself any longer. "Richard, we need to be practical here. The boy is homeless, he's a minor, and he has abilities that could revolutionize multiple industries. We have legal obligations, financial opportunities." "James," Grant's voice cut through the businessman's calculations like a blade. "Stop talking." The authority in Grant's tone silenced Harrison immediately. Grant stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Jamal's face. "Here's what's going to happen," Grant said, and suddenly he sounded like the CEO who had built a multimillion-dollar company from nothing. "Jamal is not going back to the streets. He's not going into another foster home that sees him as a resource to be exploited. He's not becoming anyone's project or experiment or business opportunity." "Then what?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Grant's voice softened again. "That depends on what Jamal wants. Not what's best for our company. Not what makes the most economic sense. Not what maximizes anyone's return on investment. What does an 11-year-old boy want for his life?" For a moment, Jamal couldn't speak. No adult had ever asked him that question. Not his foster parents, not his social workers, not the teachers who saw his test scores and immediately started planning advanced placement tracks. Everyone had always decided what was best for him based on what he could do, never on who he was or what would make him happy. "I want to go to school," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Regular school, with regular kids. I want to learn things that have nothing to do with numbers sometimes. History, art, maybe music. I want to play sports even though I'll probably be terrible at them. I want to fail a test occasionally and have it not be the end of the world." Grant nodded as if these were the most reasonable requests he'd ever heard. What else? I want someone to worry about me when I'm late coming home. I want family dinners where we talk about stupid stuff instead of homework. I want someone to be proud of me for being kind, not just for being smart. I want to matter to someone even on days when I can't solve anything. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally broke free, streaming down Jamal's dirty cheeks. And I want to help people with math sometimes, because I love it and I'm good at it, but only when I choose to. Not because anyone makes me or pays me or expects me to. Just because helping people feels good. Dr. Chun was openly crying now. Harrison had gone completely silent, staring at his shoes. Several other engineers were wiping their eyes, confronted with the humanity they had overlooked in their rush to celebrate the boy's abilities. Grant reached out slowly, giving Jamal every opportunity to pull away, and gently placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Jamal, I can't undo what other adults have done to you. I can't promise that I'll never disappoint you or make mistakes, but I can promise you this. From now on, your value as a person comes first, and your mathematical abilities come second. Always. How do I know you mean it? Jamal asked through his tears. Because I'm going to prove it, Grant replied. Starting today, Meridian Industries is establishing the Jamal Foundation, not named after you to exploit your story, but to ensure that gifted children never have to choose between developing their abilities and being loved unconditionally. You'll help design the programs, but only if you want to. And if you never want to look at another equation again, that's okay too. Grant looked around the room at his employees and investors. Everyone here is going to sign a legal document stating that they will never approach Jamal about business opportunities, never use his name or likeness for commercial purposes, and never treat his presence in their lives as anything other than the privilege of knowing an extraordinary human being. Harrison started to object, but Grant's expression silenced him immediately. The boy who solved our aircraft design problem doesn't owe us anything, Grant continued. But the man who forgot that children are more than their abilities owes him everything. So here's what I'm offering, Jamal. Not a job, not a business arrangement, not a transaction. I'm offering you a family. Real family. The kind where you matter because you exist, not because of what you can do. Jamal looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. For the first time in months, he didn't see calculation or opportunity in their eyes. He saw recognition. Not of his mathematical genius, but of his humanity. He saw adults who had been reminded that brilliance without compassion was just another form of poverty. Okay, he whispered, and the single word carried more weight than all the equations on the whiteboard. Okay, I'll try. Grant's smile was radiant as he knelt down and opened his arms. Jamal hesitated for just a moment. Trust was still a fragile, dangerous thing. Then stepped forward into the embrace of someone who saw him as more than the sum of his abilities. The hug lasted exactly 17 seconds. Jamal counted automatically, his mathematical mind still processing even in moments of pure emotion. But for those 17 seconds, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed, the possibility that he could be valued simply for being alive. When they separated, Grant's eyes were bright with unshed tears. There's a guest room in my house that's been empty for too long, he said quietly. It has terrible lighting for doing homework. The bed is probably too soft, and my housekeeper makes pancakes that are definitely too sweet. Think you could help me figure out what's wrong with all of that? Jamal's laugh was shaky but genuine. I think those sound like problems worth solving. As the room began to stir back to life, people gathering their belongings and preparing to leave, Dr. Chin approached them both. Jamal, I want you to know something. In 20 years of engineering, I've never seen mathematical intuition like yours. But more importantly, in 20 years of working with brilliant people, I've never seen someone use their gifts with such courage. You didn't just solve our problem. You taught us how to be better human beings. Harrison, who had remained silent through Grant's speech, finally stepped forward. His expression was chastened, humbled. Son, I owe you an apology. When I looked at you, I saw opportunity instead of a child who needed help. That was wrong of me. I hope someday you'll give me the chance to prove I can do better. Jamal studied the man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. Maybe, he said simply. We'll see. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Jamal turned back to look at the whiteboard one more time. His equations were still there, proof that he had contributed something valuable to the world. But more importantly, the room was filled with adults who had been reminded of their own humanity. That felt like the more important equation he had solved. Grant placed his hand gently on Jamal's shoulder, not possessively, not as a claim of ownership, but as a gesture of protection and care. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home. The word felt foreign and precious all at once. Jamal adjusted his worn backpack on his shoulders and nodded. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not because he might solve an interesting mathematical problem, but because he might wake up somewhere he belonged. As they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the whiteboard covered with numbers and the room full of expensive suits, Jamal realized that the most complex equation he had ever solved wasn't about aircraft design or wing stress analysis. It was the delicate mathematics of trust, the careful calculation of hope, the precise formula that transforms a brilliant mind into a valued human being. The elevator doors closed behind them, carrying a homeless boy and a humbled businessman toward a future neither had imagined that morning. Behind them, on the whiteboard, Jamal's equation stood as testament not just to his mathematical genius, but to the more important truth he had taught them all, that intelligence is only truly valuable when it serves humanity, and humanity is only truly served when we see each person as infinitely more than the sum of their abilities. Outside the building, the city continued its busy rhythm, unaware that in one conference room on the 16th floor, a small boy had solved more than just an engineering problem. He had solved the equation of what it means to be both gifted and loved, brilliant and cherished, extraordinary and beautifully, wonderfully human. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces as Grant and Jamal stepped onto the sidewalk together. For the first time in 3 weeks, Jamal wasn't calculating the safest place to sleep that night or the probability of finding food in the dumpster behind the corner restaurant. Instead, he was thinking about pancakes that were too sweet and a bed that might be too soft and the strange, wonderful mathematics of belonging somewhere. "You know," Grant said as they walked toward his car, "I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I've never been a father before." Jamal looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's okay," he replied. "I've never been a son before either. Maybe we can figure out together." Grant's laughter was rich and genuine, echoing off the glass walls of the building behind them. "I think that sounds like a problem worth solving," he said, and as they drove away together, heading toward a home where Jamal would finally be valued for who he was rather than what he could do, the boy who could see mathematical patterns in everything around him discovered the most beautiful equation of all, that love multiplied by trust, added to hope, and divided by nothing, equals family. The city rushed past the car windows, full of angles and patterns and mathematical relationships. But for once, Jamal wasn't calculating. He was just a boy going home, to a place where he would matter not because he was a genius, but because he was himself. And that, he thought as the afternoon light danced through the window, was the most perfect solution he had ever found.